Hey friend, Colin here from Sumthins Recording, and today I'm going to show you how to mix tight snare drum for more size and impact. I'm going to start by playing you the finished snare drum sound inside the entire mix here, then we'll take it down to just the drums, and finally I'll solo up just the snare drum as well before we jump into the processing on the drum here. So here's our snare drum inside the finished mix.
Well, together I walk beside you. I have come to lose that spark, and I feel myself a cog in something turning. Well, together
So you can hear how tight our snare drum sound is. And the problem with tight snare drums is that they sound great on their own. You get them nice and tight and nice and punchy. It sounds like a great snare drum sound, and then you stick it inside of an entire mix and suddenly you don't have the impact, you don't have any length on the snare drum, and it's just this sharp transient and it disappears. So how do we solve that? How do we work with that to get it to sit properly inside the track? There's a couple things I'm doing here to get this tight snare drum to fit inside of a more rock style mix like this. Let me also play you here the raw snare drum by itself, and then we'll run through the processing here and talk about what I'm doing. So here's the raw snare drum, just the top and bottom by themselves. So you can hear it's this tight snare drum sound. It has that little bit of air on the top end, that nice little pop to it, and then it has some beef down on the bottom end, but it doesn't have any mid-range, doesn't have any length to it. It's just this fleeting moment of pop on the snare drum, and then it's gone. So what are we doing here on the snare drum to get it to sit inside the mix, give it some more size, and then give it some impact as well? First thing I'm doing here is I'm just running a little bit of a limiter just to take off some of the transient on some of these hits. So just watch, we're doing maybe a little bit on the snare drum. Like a dB to 2 dB of limiting there on some of the bigger hits. You can see the ceiling is all the way down, so it is a quiet signal coming in on the snare drum because it is so tight and so fleeting there, but about 2 dB of limiting helps us shave off the transient and get our snare drum a little bit more even going into our EQ. And this looks like a wild EQ. So we're gonna go through these moves here in just a second, but I'm gonna turn all of these top guys off. The first thing I'm doing here is a high pass filter. So I'm going to roll up right below the fundamental on the snare drum here just to get rid of any excess. You can hear there's a lot of kick bleed coming through here, and I don't want it to be bottom end heavy. So just rolling in this high pass, take a listen. Not changing the snare sound too drastically, but it gives us a little bit more room to work with if we do need to boost bottom end so our kick drum isn't coming up there. Before we get to all these crazy boosts up here shaping the sound of the drum, I'm going to throw my compressor in. And this for me is one of the pieces to getting the snare drum to have some extra length to it, so it does have a bit more size in the track. The tighter the snare drum sound, usually the smaller it ends up sounding inside the track because there's no back end, there's no length for your ear to hear. It's just this fleeting moment of pop and then it's gone. And inside a track, the more stuff you add, the smaller that pop, the smaller that transient is gonna feel. So using the release here and setting it in time helps us get a little bit more length out of the snare drum. So take a listen here. We've got about a 20 millisecond attack, 100 millisecond release, 3-to-1 ratio here. We're going to be doing maybe 6 dB reduction here on our snare drum. So a couple of things here. We're emphasizing that initial transient to give our snare drum some attack, emphasizing that front end attack there, and then using our release to set it in time. So it's kind of hitting with the snare drum and then letting go. That's kind of how our compressor is working with our drum. We're not holding on too long with the release. The longer we hold on with the release, we're going to actually end up tightening our snare drum sound. We want it to hit and let go so we can hear that back end air and give it a little bit more length, or give the illusion that we have more length on the snare drum here. Listen one more time without and then with. You can hear it. It brings up a little bit of ring too, which is kind of nice, so it's not so dead sounding on the snare drum. Now we've got a lot of moves here trying to get some more energy and size as well as impact in the mid-range here out of our snare drum. The first thing I'm always reaching for is a little bit of top end, so we're up at 9K. I said a little bit here, but 11 dB boost at 9K, trying to bring out that snare sound and emphasize that nice beautiful air and pop, trying to extend our snare drum here. So take a listen without and then with this 11 dB boost. So that's giving us a lot of beautiful top end on the snare drum, but now you can see we've got this huge scoop from like the bottom end all the way up to the top end here. We gave it some top end, so it's not so bottom end heavy, but now let's fix the mid-range here. Oops, I'm moving all things around here. The next big boost I went for here is about 14 dB at almost 1.5K, 1.41K here. This is a massive boost to try and flatten out the snare drum sound and give it some mid-range so it has some impact and some cut inside the mix here. So take a listen. I'll turn this 14 dB boost on, about 1.5K. So to me, this is a crucial move in getting this snare drum shaped so it's going to cut through in the mix. We have that top end, we have that bottom end, but when you hear it inside the track with that, it's kind of just this little puff of air, the bottom end air and the top end air. There's no crack and there's no impact to it. So adding all this mid-range gives us a sense of size as well as impact inside the mix here. Now we have two other moves here. I wanted to add a little bit more underneath this boost and a little bit more above it. So still working in kind of the mid-range and the high mids here. We've got about a 4.5 dB boost at 3K and then about a 4 dB boost at 700. So take a listen to what these two do to kind of, again, flatten out the curve of our snare drum. Now we've got some crack and we've got some attack on our snare drum that's going to help it cut through in the mix. The next couple things I'm doing here is I have one more limiter. We boosted a ton of mid-range and a ton of crack on the snare drum, a ton of attack. So we want to make sure that's controlled and that our snare drum's not moving all over the place. So one more limiter here, just shaving off 1 to 2 dB here again. So just holding our snare drum transient in place there. And again, as we add attack here, so we added a ton of crack, and then we're using a limiter to kind of flatten out that transient a little bit. It again helps us bring up the back end of the snare drum to give it a little bit more length and let your ear hear more of the back end, the release of the snare drum. Now, last thing we're doing here, EQ-wise, is I'm adding again a little bit more mid-range, bringing up some bottom end so it does have some size to it, and then there was a little bit of a ringing frequency that came up after all this boosting that I'm pulling out around 250 here. So take a listen to what these moves are doing. These are kind of one big move altogether, right? We're boosting bottom end and mid-range, and then pulling out a frequency that came up ringing. So giving our snare some bottom end and emphasizing that fundamental there. And you can kind of see as I hit play there, our snare curve is now a little bit more flat. So we're not missing a big chunk of mid-range and high mids here. We have everything we need. We have a full frequency spectrum now on our snare drum to work with. So now that we've got some size, we've got some impact to it, let's take it a little bit further, give it some more length, and give it some more impact inside the track. It's one thing to have impact by itself, and then you tuck it inside the track, and sometimes you start to lose that impact and that length as you stack more things on top. So the next thing I'm adding here is just my normal room emulation here on the drums. So sending into this Bricasti close reverb. This is just the Studio B, Room 2 Studio B, the close mics here, and I've got it dialed back to be a shorter room sound, so 400 milliseconds here. So take a listen with just that in place now. So this is our snare drum and then the room sound as well. So now we've got a little bit of verb and a little bit of depth on our snare drum here, but I'm going to take it one step further. So that's kind of our global room sound, but I wanted the snare to have more length inside the track so it wasn't such a fleeting moment every time he hit it. So I'm adding in the Sun Studios plate reverb here, which is again just another impulse response from the Bricasti emulation here. And this is just the Sun plate. It's the A plate here, and it's a 4-second plate reverb. So it's a really, really long plate reverb. But when I put it on the snare drum here, so take a listen, this is just the snare drum, and then I'm going to turn the Sun plate on. You can hear how much length that's giving our snare drum. And it again emphasizes that nice pop, but it helps it stay consistent. It helps it drag out a little bit longer, and it helps your ear identify the snare drum inside the track. So it's not just this pop, it actually has some length and release to it. And I'm using an EQ to roll off most of the bottom end here on the reverb because I don't want to add more fundamental. I want that to mainly come from the actual spot mic on the snare drum. I just want to emphasize that nice pop and bring out the mid-range length on the snare drum. So all together now, here's what our snare drum sounds like inside the drum kit with our room emulation and then our plate reverb on it as well. You can hear all that extra size we're getting out of the snare drum from our EQ, from our room emulations, and all the impact we're getting from the extra reverb and the extra length we built into our snare drum. So let's throw this back inside the full mix here and take a listen. I'll do a little A/B on our processing on the snare drum as well.
Well, the girl I want beside you, I have come to lose that spark, and I feel myself caught in something turning. Well, the girl I want beside you, I have come to lose that spark, and I feel myself caught in something turning. Well, the girl I want beside you, I have come to lose that spark, and I feel myself caught.
So if you're trying to get some extra size and some extra impact out of a tight snare drum sound, remember our EQ is crucial here to kind of flatten out our curve, get it some mid-range so it cuts through and has some impact in the track, using our compressor to make sure our release lets go in time that we hear more of the back end of our snare drum, using our limiter to kind of flatten out the transient, even out the tone of our snare drum, getting some bottom end here and pulling out any ringing frequencies before we add reverb to give the snare drum a little bit extra impact, that pop in the track, as well as extend the length and size of our drum. I hope that was helpful for you if you are looking to go a little bit deeper into the mixing process in its entirety and really start to hone your workflow as an audio engineer. Then I have just the tool for you, and it is completely free. It is my 7-step mixing checklist, and it's just a simple PDF guide that will walk you through the entire mixing process step by step to help you get professional and radio-ready mixes without any more of the guesswork. Like I said, completely free for you to download, and you can get access to that by clicking the link below in the video description. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.